Welcome, dear listener, to this quiet corner of the evening where stories unfold like gentle mists across ancient cobblestones, where mysteries whisper rather than shout, and where the mind finds rest in the soft rhythm of narrative. Tonight, we journey together to Victorian London, to that most famous address where firelight dances against wallpaper and the rain speaks its eternal language against window panes. This story is meant to carry you softly towards sleep, to let your thoughts slow and settle like snowflakes finding their resting place. There is no urgency here, no need to remember every detail. Simply let the words wash over you. Let the images form and dissolve as they will, and allow yourself to drift wherever the tale may take you. Before we begin, I wonder, wherever you are in this wide world, what brings you here tonight? Perhaps you are curled beneath blankets as winter presses against your windows, or maybe you lie in summer warmth with crickets singing their ancient songs beyond your walls. Wherever you find yourself, you are welcome here, in this space between waking and dreaming. Now settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The December fog pressed itself against London like a living thing, thick and gray and filled with the secrets of 1,000 chimneys. At 221 B. Baker Street, the familiar sitting room glowed with the amber warmth of a generous fire, its flames performing their endless dance of light and shadow across the walls. Sherlock Holmes sat in his customary armchair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight as he stared into the flames with that peculiar intensity that might suggest meditation or might suggest a mind working through labyrinths of logic invisible to ordinary observers. The mantelpiece clock ticked its steady rhythm, a heartbeat for the room itself, while outside the rain had begun its evening performance, starting as a whisper against the glass and building gradually into a steady percussion that filled the silence with comfort. Dr. John Watson occupied the chair opposite, a medical journal open upon his lap, though his attention had drifted from the printed page to the pleasant drowsiness that such evenings invariably produced. The fire crackled softly, sending up occasional sparks like tiny stars being born and dying in the space of a breath. Mrs. Hudson had brought tea an hour earlier, a sturdy pot that still retained some warmth beneath its cozy, alongside a plate of her excellent shortbread that had been steadily diminishing throughout the evening. The gaslight burned low, adding its own golden contribution to the room's illumination, creating pools of brightness and shadow that transformed the familiar space into something from a storybook. "Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice scarcely rising above the sound of the rain. "Do you believe in curses?" Watson stirred from his comfortable contemplation, marking his place in the journal with one finger. "Curses, Holmes? That seems rather outside your usual sphere of rational inquiry." "Indeed," Holmes replied, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "And yet, what arrives by tonight's post but a letter concerning precisely such a matter? A curse, Watson, allegedly placed upon a charitable organization by none other than the spirit of Christmas itself." Watson set aside his journal, his interest genuinely piqued despite the late hour and the soporific warmth of the fire. "The spirit of Christmas? You cannot be serious." Holmes unfolded himself from his chair with that peculiar grace that always reminded Watson of a cat, all controlled economy of movement. He crossed to his desk, where papers lay scattered in what appeared to be chaos, but what Watson knew to be a system, comprehensible only to Holmes himself. He retrieved a cream-colored envelope, heavy paper of good quality, and returned to his chair, settling once more into its comfortable embrace. "The letter comes from a Miss Eleanor Ashworth," Holmes began, his voice taking on that storytelling quality that made even the recitation of facts into something approaching poetry. She serves as secretary to the London Charitable Christmas Society, an organization dedicated to providing aid and comfort to the city's unfortunate during the festive season. For 30 years, they have operated without incident, distributing food, coal, and small gifts to those in need. They work from a warehouse near the docks, a building donated to them by a wealthy benefactor long since departed this world. The rain intensified for a moment, drumming more insistently against the windows, then subsided again into its gentler rhythm. Watson reached for his teacup, finding it still pleasantly warm, and sipped slowly while Holmes continued. 3 weeks ago, according to Miss Ashworth's account, strange events began to occur. Donations would vanish overnight despite locked doors and windows. Volunteers reported seeing a figure dressed as Father Christmas wandering the warehouse after hours, a figure that would disappear when approached. Most disturbingly, those who encountered this apparition soon found themselves beset by ill fortune. A broken leg here, a house fire there, financial reverses, sudden illnesses. Holmes paused, his eyes meeting Watson's across the firelit space. Yesterday, the society's chairman collapsed during a meeting, clutching at his chest and crying out that Santa Claus had cursed them all for their sins. Good heavens, Watson breathed. Is the man alive? Barely. He lingers in hospital, unconscious and unresponsive. The doctors can find no physical cause for his collapse. Holmes tapped the letter against his palm thoughtfully. Miss Ashworth writes in desperation. The society faces dissolution if these events continue. Volunteers refuse to enter the warehouse. Donations have ceased. She has heard through some channel or other of my services and begs that I investigate this most unusual matter. Watson set down his teacup with a soft clink of china against saucer. The fire popped gently, sending up a small shower of sparks that died before reaching the grate. Outside, a carriage passed in the street below, its wheels making a wet, rushing sound on the rain-slick cobbles, the horse's hooves a muffled rhythm already fading into the night. A curse from Santa Claus, Watson mused. It sounds like something from a penny dreadful. Precisely why it interests me, Holmes replied, leaning forward slightly. The theatrical nature of it all, Watson. Someone has gone to considerable trouble to create this atmosphere of supernatural dread. The question is why, and to what purpose? He rose again, moving to the window where he stood looking out into the fog-shrouded street, his silhouette sharp against the diffused glow of the street lamp. Miss Ashworth will call upon us tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. I have sent word that we will take the case. Before you fall asleep, write in the comments what time it is for you and where you are from. Watson smiled, recognizing the signs of Holmes's engagement with a new puzzle. Sleep, for the detective, would now be fitful until some answers began to emerge. For his own part, Watson felt the comfortable weight of approaching slumber, enhanced by the warmth and the rain and the security of their familiar rooms. He retrieved his journal once more, though he suspected he would read no more than a paragraph before drowsiness claimed him entirely. Do you have any preliminary theories? Watson asked, more from habit than genuine expectation of revelation at this early stage. Holmes turned from the window, his face half in shadow, half illuminated by the firelight. Theories, no. Observations, several. The timing is significant. These events begin precisely as the Christmas season reaches its height, when the society would be at its busiest and most visible. The theatrical nature suggests someone with a flair for the dramatic, possibly experience in stagecraft or performance. The specific targeting of the chairman suggests personal animosity or a desire to destroy the organization's leadership, and the choice of Santa Claus as the vehicle for this campaign of terror is either deeply ironic or deeply symbolic, perhaps both. He moved away from the window, pacing slowly before the fire, his shadow elongating and contracting across the wall as he moved. Someone wishes this charity destroyed, Watson, but they wish it done in a manner that appears supernatural that cannot be traced to human agency. They want fear and superstition to do their work for them. It is quite clever, really, preying upon that peculiar mixture of reverence and anxiety that surrounds the Christmas season, that liminal time when people are most susceptible to believing in magic, both light and dark. Watson nodded slowly, his eyelids growing heavier. The room seemed to pulse gently with the firelight, the rain providing an endless white noise that smoothed away the edges of thought. Holmes continued speaking, but his voice had become part of the room's ambiance now, another element in the symphony of comfort that the evening had composed. We shall visit the warehouse tomorrow, Holmes was saying, his tone thoughtful and distant. Examine the locks, the windows, the floor for unusual marks. Interview Miss Ashworth and any volunteers brave enough to speak with us. Somewhere in the physical evidence will be the key to this puzzle, Watson. Ghosts do not walk through walls without leaving traces comprehensible to the trained observer. This Father Christmas, curse or no curse, is flesh and blood can be found and understood and ultimately apprehended. The fire settled with a soft sigh, the coals palms glowing deep red beneath a delicate frosting of ash. Watson's journal slipped from his fingers. Caught at the last moment before it could slide to the floor, he set it carefully on the side table, acknowledging defeat in his battle against sleep. Holmes noticed and smiled, that rare, genuine expression of affection that occasionally broke through his usual reserve. "Rest, old friend," Holmes said softly. "Tomorrow we hunt ghosts through London's winter streets, but tonight there is only warmth and rain and the quiet comfort of home. Dream peacefully." Watson murmured something indistinct, already half submerged in sleep's gentle waters. Holmes returned to his chair, reaching for his pipe and tobacco pouch. He would sit here through the small hours, watching the fire burn down to embers, his mind turning over the facts of this curious case, like a jeweler examining facets of an unusual stone. The rain continued its soft percussion against the windows, the clock ticked its eternal rhythm, and the room settled into that deepest quiet that comes in the hours between midnight and dawn, when the city itself seems to hold its breath and wait for the light to return. Morning arrived not with brightness, but with a gradual lessening of darkness, the fog still clinging to London like a reluctant guest who knows not when to depart. Watson descended the stairs to find Holmes already dressed and standing by the window, a teacup balanced in one hand while the other held back the curtain, his gaze fixed upon the street below with that particular quality of attention that suggested he was cataloging every passerby, every delivery cart, every subtle movement in the gray morning light. The fire had been rebuilt, crackling cheerfully in the grate, and Mrs. Hudson had laid out breakfast on the small table, toast and marmalade, eggs kept warm under a silver cover, a fresh pot of tea steaming gently in the cool air that seemed to seep through even the best-sealed windows on such mornings. "Good morning, Watson," Holmes said without turning from his observation post. "You slept well, I trust. Your breathing suggested the deep rest of a man unburdened by mysterious curses and theatrical phantoms." Watson poured himself tea, the liquid amber dark and fragrant, warming his hands through the china cup. "Quite well, thank you, though I confess the rain provided a rather persistent lullaby throughout the night. Has Miss Ashworth arrived yet?" "Not yet, though she will be punctual." Her letter suggested a woman of precise habits and considerable organizational ability. The handwriting alone tells a story of discipline and attention to detail. Holmes finally released the curtain and moved toward the breakfast table, though he took only toast, nibbling at it absently while his mind clearly occupied itself elsewhere. "I have been considering the symbolic implications of choosing Father Christmas as the vehicle for this campaign of terror. It represents a perversion of the season's most benevolent figure, a corruption of childhood innocence and charitable goodwill. Our antagonist possesses either a deeply cynical nature or a profound grievance against the very concept of Christmas charity." The clock on the mantelpiece marked the passing minutes with its steady voice, each tick a small punctuation in the morning quiet. Watson settled into his chair with his breakfast, grateful for the solid comfort of eggs and toast after the previous evening's light supper. The fog pressed against the windows like a living presence, reducing the world beyond to vague shapes and muffled sounds, the occasional clip of horse hooves, the distant call of a street vendor, the general murmur of the city awakening to another December day. At precisely 10 o'clock, the bell rang below, and shortly thereafter, Mrs. Hudson's footsteps could be heard ascending the stairs. She appeared in the doorway, slightly flushed from the climb, announcing, "Miss Eleanor Ashworth to see you, Mr. Holmes." The woman who entered embodied exactly what her letter had suggested, a person of middle years, dressed in practical dark gray wool, her hair arranged in a neat bun beneath a modest hat, her gloves showing careful mending at the fingertips. Her face bore the marks of sleepless nights and considerable worry, fine lines around her eyes speaking of habitual concern, but her bearing remained upright, her handshake firm when Holmes greeted her, her voice steady despite the tremor Watson detected beneath its surface. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I cannot adequately express my gratitude that you have agreed to see me." She settled into the chair Holmes indicated, accepting tea but refusing anything to eat, her hands wrapped around the cup as though drawing strength from its warmth. "The situation has grown even more dire since I wrote to you. Last night, another volunteer was injured. Young Thomas Reeves, barely 17, was found unconscious near the warehouse loading dock, a gash across his forehead, and no memory of how he came to be there. The constabulary dismisses it as a robbery gone wrong, but Thomas swears he saw the cursed Santa Claus moments before losing consciousness. Holmes had assumed his listening posture, body angled slightly forward, fingers steepled, his entire being focused upon his client with an intensity that Watson knew could be both comforting and slightly unnerving. "Tell me about the warehouse itself, Miss Ashworth. Its history, its layout, who possesses keys, what security measures you employ." Miss Ashworth drew a long breath, organizing her thoughts with visible effort. The building was donated to the Society 30 years ago by Sir Reginald Thorne, a shipping magnate who made his fortune in the India trade. He was a generous man, though somewhat eccentric in his final years. The warehouse served his business until his death, after which his will specified it should be given to any organization dedicated to Christmas charity. We have occupied it ever since. She paused to sip her tea, her hands trembling slightly, the cup rattling delicately against the saucer. Outside, the fog seemed to thicken, reducing the already dim morning light to a pewter gloom that made the fire's glow even more welcome. Holmes rose to add coal to the flames, the action somehow not interrupting Miss Ashworth's narrative, but rather providing a comfortable pause in which she could gather her next thoughts. The warehouse is 3 stories, though we use primarily the ground floor for sorting and distributing goods. The upper floors contain storage, donations waiting to be processed, old records, furniture no longer needed but too good to discard. There are 4 keys to the main entrance. I keep one, our chairman Mr. Pemberton holds another, our treasurer Mr. Blackwood has the 3rd, and the 4th hangs in my office for emergencies. All windows on the ground floor have bars, installed by Sir Reginald during his tenure. The upper floor windows are unbarred but quite high, 15 feet at least from the ground. Holmes had moved to his desk, retrieving paper and pencil, sketching what Watson recognized as a preliminary diagram based on Miss Ashworth's description. And the figure that has been seen, this phantom Father Christmas, describe him as completely as possible. Height, build, manner of movement, any distinguishing characteristics. Miss Ashworth closed her eyes, clearly attempting to recall details from accounts she had heard rather than personal observation. The descriptions vary somewhat, which troubles me greatly. Some say he is tall, others insist he is average height. All agree he wears the traditional red suit trimmed with white fur, though some mention the suit appears old and stained, nothing like the cheerful costumes one sees in shop windows. He carries a large sack over one shoulder, though what it might contain, no one knows. His beard, they say, is long and white, but somehow wrong, matted or artificial looking, and his eyes. She opened her own eyes, and Watson saw genuine fear there. Everyone who has seen him mentions the eyes. Cold, they say, empty, like looking into a void rather than a human face. The room fell silent, save for the fire's gentle crackling and the persistent whisper of rain that had resumed its song against the windows. Holmes continued his sketching, adding notes in his precise hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. Watson refilled Miss Ashworth's teacup, noting how she clutched it as though it were an anchor in uncertain seas. "The curse itself," Holmes said, not looking up from his work. "Has anyone claimed to hear actual words from this figure, or is the curse inferred from the subsequent misfortunes?" "No words," Miss Ashworth replied. "At least, none that anyone has reported clearly. Some volunteers speak of hearing whispers, low mutterings they could not quite make out, but nothing distinct. The idea of a curse arose after Mr. Pemberton's collapse. He apparently cried out something about the sins of Christmas and punishment for the wicked before losing consciousness. Since then, the notion has taken hold among our volunteers that we are somehow being punished, though for what transgression no one can say." Holmes set aside his sketch and returned to his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Has the society had any disputes recently? Disgruntled former volunteers, disagreements over how funds are allocated, conflicts with other charitable organizations, anything that might create an enemy willing to pursue such an elaborate campaign of disruption?" Miss Ashworth considered this carefully, her face reflecting the effort of mental review. "We had a volunteer last year who left under somewhat difficult circumstances, a Mr. Cornelius Flagg. He believed the society should focus exclusively on providing religious education along with material aid, and when the board declined to change our charter, he departed quite angrily. But surely he would not go to such lengths merely over a philosophical disagreement? People have committed murder over philosophical disagreements, Miss Ashworth, Holmes observed mildly. We must consider every possibility, however remote it may seem. Tell me about Sir Reginald Thorne. You mentioned he was eccentric in his final years. In what manner? A flicker of something, discomfort perhaps, or uncertainty, crossed Miss Ashworth's features. He became obsessed with Christmas, Mr. Holmes, not in the cheerful manner one might expect, but rather darkly. He would speak of Christmas as a time of reckoning, when accounts must be settled and debts must be paid. His servants reported that he would wear a Father Christmas costume in his private chambers, though for what purpose, no one knew. After his death, the costume was found in a trunk in the warehouse attic, along with various journals and papers we never quite knew what to do with. They remained there still, gathering dust among the other forgotten things. Holmes's eyes brightened with unmistakable interest. That spark Watson knew indicated the scent of a trail worth following. These journals and papers, they have never been examined thoroughly? I confess they have not. Sir Reginald's handwriting was difficult, and the contents seemed to be merely the rambling thoughts of a mind affected by age and illness. We stored them away and forgot about them, I'm afraid. Then that is where we shall begin, Holmes announced, rising from his chair with sudden energy. Watson, fetch your coat and hat. Miss Ashworth, if you would be so kind as to conduct us to your warehouse, we shall examine both the scene of these mysterious events and the papers of Sir Reginald Thorne. Somewhere in the convergence of past and present lies the key to this puzzle. Miss Ashworth stood, relief visible in the relaxing of her shoulders, the slight color returning to her pale cheeks. Oh, Mr. Holmes, thank you. I have been carrying this burden alone for so long, unable to convince anyone that something genuinely wrong is occurring. The police think me hysterical, the board thinks me superstitious, and the volunteers think me cursed. To have someone believe me, someone willing to investigate seriously, is more comfort than I can express. Within minutes, they had assembled themselves for the journey. Coats buttoned against the damp cold, hats secured, Watson's medical bag brought along from habit, and Holmes's magnifying glass tucked into an inner pocket. They descended to the street where the fog embraced them immediately, reducing visibility to perhaps 20 feet, transforming familiar London into a realm of shadows and suggestions, where sounds seemed to come from no particular direction and distance became impossible to judge. Miss Ashworth led them eastward, toward the docks, their footsteps echoing oddly in the muffled air. They passed through streets that grew progressively less prosperous, the buildings more weathered, the people more worn, until they reached a district where warehouses loomed like sleeping giants, and the smell of the Thames mixed with coal smoke and 1,000 other urban scents. The warehouse of the London Charitable Christmas Society stood among its fellows, distinguished only by a faded sign above its door and perhaps a slightly more cheerful paint color, though the fog drained all hues to gray, making even this uncertain. Miss Ashworth produced her key, the lock turning with a well-oiled click that spoke of regular use and good maintenance. The door swung inward, revealing darkness pierced only by the gray light filtering through high windows. She located and lit a lamp, its glow pushing back the shadows to reveal a cavernous space filled with wooden crates and barrels, tables arranged for sorting goods, and along one wall, shelf after shelf of carefully organized supplies. Tinned foods, blankets, children's toys, all the physical manifestation of charitable intention. The attic is this way, Miss Ashworth said, her voice hushed in the empty warehouse, leading them toward a narrow staircase in the far corner, its steps worn smooth by decades of use, creaking softly beneath their weight as they climbed into the upper reaches of the building, where dust motes danced in the lamplight, and the smell of age and forgotten things grew thick as the fog outside. The attic stretched before them like a museum of abandoned intentions, vast and shadowy, despite the lamp Miss Ashworth carried, filled with the accumulated detritus of 3 decades of charitable work and whatever Sir Reginald Thorne had left behind before that. Furniture hulked under dust sheets that had themselves become dusty, creating ghost-like shapes in the dim light. Wooden crates were stacked against walls, some marked with faded ink, denoting their contents. Winter coats, 1888. Toys, Misk, 1892. Blankets, moth damage. The floorboards creaked with each step, a language of wood and nails speaking of age and patient endurance. High windows, grimy with years of London's exhalations, allowed only the most reluctant daylight to enter, giving the space an underwater quality, as though they had descended rather than ascended, sinking into some quiet place beneath the city's surface. Holmes moved through this landscape with purpose, his sharp eyes cataloging everything, occasionally pausing to examine a footprint in the dust or to test the security of a window latch. Watson followed more slowly, his medical training making him note the mustiness of the air, the potential for respiratory irritation, the way the cold seemed more penetrating here than it had been in the street below. Miss Ashworth remained near the stairway, her lamp held high, watching Holmes with an expression that mingled hope and apprehension. "The trunk containing Sir Reginald's effects is there," she indicated, pointing toward the far corner, where a large leather-bound trunk sat beneath one of the cleaner windows, its brass fittings dulled by time but still substantial. "We moved it there years ago when we needed space for Christmas donations. I confess I had nearly forgotten its existence until these recent troubles brought Sir Reginald's eccentricities back to mind." Holmes crossed to the trunk, kneeling before it like a supplicant at an altar, his long fingers tracing the leather surface, testing the lock. Finding it unfastened, he lifted the lid, and even from his position several feet away, Watson could smell the particular scent that emerged. Old paper, fabric that had not been disturbed in years, the faint trace of tobacco and perhaps cologne, the archaeology of a life preserved in darkness. The detective began removing items with careful reverence, setting them on the floor beside him. First came the father Christmas costume Miss Ashworth had mentioned, red velvet worn thin in places, white fur trim that had yellowed with age, a wide black belt with a tarnished buckle. The beard followed, surprisingly realistic when examined closely, constructed of real hair mounted on a wire frame designed to hook over the ears. Holmes held it up to the light, studying it intently, his magnifying glass emerging from his pocket to examine the construction in minute detail. "Professionally made," he murmured, more to himself than to his companions. "Theater quality, not a commercial costume. Expensive when new. And see here, Watson, the beard shows signs of recent disturbance. Dust has been displaced along these edges, suggesting handling within the past few weeks." Watson moved closer, peering at the evidence Holmes indicated. Indeed, the beard showed cleaner patches where fingers had gripped it, marks that stood out against the general accumulation of years. "Someone has been in this trunk recently, then. Your phantom, perhaps, costuming himself for his performance." "Precisely," Holmes agreed, setting the beard aside and reaching deeper into the trunk. He extracted several leather-bound journals, their covers cracked with age, pages visible between the boards where the binding had loosened. Beneath these lay loose papers, letters tied with ribbon, what appeared to be business documents, and at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, something that caused Holmes to pause, his expression sharpening with interest. He unwrapped the oilcloth carefully, revealing a wooden box perhaps 8 inches square, ornately carved with symbols that Watson did not immediately recognize. Stars and moons, various geometric patterns, letters from alphabets both familiar and strange. The box had no visible lock, but neither did it open when Holmes attempted to lift the lid. He turned it over in his hands, his fingers exploring every surface, until he found a small catch cunningly concealed within the decorative carving. A soft click, and the lid opened to reveal the box's interior, lined with faded red silk and containing a single item, a pendant on a tarnished silver chain, its design echoing the carvings on the box. A star enclosed within a circle, with strange letters running around the circumference. "What do you make of this, Watson?" Holmes asked, holding the pendant up so it caught what little light filtered through the dirty windows, turning slowly and casting tiny reflections around the attic space. Watson examined it carefully, aware of Miss Ashworth drawing closer, her curiosity overcoming her hesitation. "It appears to be some sort of talisman or amulet. The symbols suggest occult significance, though whether genuinely ancient or merely theatrical, I cannot say. Sir Reginald's interest in such things?" "Apparently so," Miss Ashworth said softly, her voice carrying a note of unease. "His servants did mention that he had begun collecting strange objects in his final years, though they knew few details. He would spend hours in his study with books on obscure subjects, mysticism, ancient religions, folklore. His family grew quite concerned, though his mind remained sharp enough for business matters. Holmes returned the pendant to its box and set it aside, turning his attention to the journals. He opened the first, squinting at the handwriting that lived up to Miss Ashworth's description. Cramped and difficult, slanting erratically across the page, some passages written in normal ink, while others appeared to use different colors, perhaps for emphasis or category. He read silently for several minutes, turning pages with increasing absorption. While Watson and Miss Ashworth waited in the dusty quiet, the only sounds the occasional creak of the building settling and the distant murmur of the city beyond. "Fascinating," Holmes finally said, looking up from the journal, his eyes bright with the particular excitement of discovery. Sir Reginald was not merely collecting occult trinkets for amusement. He believed himself to be engaged in serious, magical study, specifically focused on the concept of judgment and retribution. He writes here about Christmas as a time when the veil between worlds grows thin, when accounts must be balanced, when those who have sinned through the year must face consequences. He turned the journal so Watson could see a particular passage, though the handwriting remained challenging. He references something he calls the Christmas Tribunal, a supernatural court that sits in judgment of those who have violated the sacred obligations of charity and compassion. According to his beliefs, those who give falsely, who use charity as a mask for pride or for personal gain, will be punished by agents of this tribunal. Miss Ashworth had grown quite pale, her hand at her throat. "But we are a legitimate charity, Mr. Holmes. We help those in genuine need. Surely we have committed no sin that would warrant such attention, supernatural or otherwise." "I make no judgment on the validity of Sir Reginald's beliefs," Holmes assured her, his tone gentle despite the intensity of his interest. "I am merely reporting what he wrote. The question that interests me is whether someone else has read these journals, absorbed these ideas, and decided to put them into theatrical practice. The Phantom Father Christmas, the curse, the misfortunes, all could be someone enacting Sir Reginald's vision of judgment and retribution." He stood, brushing dust from his knees, gathering the journals and the carved box. "I should like to borrow these materials for closer study. With your permission, Miss Ashworth, I will take them to Baker Street, where I can examine them properly. Watson, while I do that, would you be so good as to examine the ground floor? Look for any signs of how our phantom enters and exits this building. Check the locks, the windows, any access points that might not be immediately obvious." Watson nodded, grateful for a concrete task, and equally grateful to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the attic. Miss Ashworth provided him with a lamp, and he descended the narrow stairs carefully, emerging into the main warehouse floor, where the air, while still cold, felt less weighted with the past. He began his examination methodically, walking the perimeter of the space, testing each window's bars, all secure, showing no signs of tampering. The main door's lock appeared solid, no scratches or marks suggesting forced entry. A smaller side door proved equally secure, its hinges well maintained and showing no evidence of recent disturbance. The warehouse revealed itself more clearly as Watson's eyes adjusted to the available light. The organization was impressive, donations sorted by type and stored in clearly labeled areas, records kept in neat ledgers on a desk in one corner, everything speaking of Miss Ashworth's efficient management. Yet there was something else, a quality Watson found difficult to name, a sense of watching or waiting that might have been merely his imagination responding to Miss Ashworth's fears, but felt nonetheless real in the quiet space. He found himself drawn to the area where young Thomas Reeves had been discovered, near the loading dock, a raised platform where goods could be transferred directly to and from carts. The floor here showed scuff marks, though whether from the recent incident or from normal warehouse operations, Watson could not determine. He knelt, examining the boards more closely, finding what might have been a darker stain that could have been blood, though it was difficult to be certain in the uncertain light. A sound from above made him look up sharply, footsteps crossing the floor overhead, too heavy to be Miss Ashworth, too purposeful to be Holmes's usual tread. Watson rose, his hand instinctively reaching for the revolver that he had not brought, feeling suddenly vulnerable in the dim warehouse. The footsteps continued, moving toward what he judged to be the position of the stairs, and then he heard voices. Holmes's familiar tones and another deeper voice, masculine and carrying a note of authority or perhaps anger. Watson moved quickly toward the stairs, arriving just as Holmes descended with Miss Ashworth close behind, followed by a large man in a dark overcoat, his face florid with emotion, his substantial whiskers quivering with indignation. The man's presence filled the space, his bulk and his obvious agitation creating an energy that seemed to push against the warehouse walls. "This is Mr. Horace Blackwood, the Society's treasurer," Holmes announced, his expression neutral but his eyes alert. "He has joined us unexpectedly. Mr. Blackwood, this is my colleague, Dr. John Watson." Blackwood barely acknowledged the introduction, his attention fixed on Holmes with what Watson recognized as barely contained hostility. "I came to check on our stores and find strangers rifling through Sir Reginald's private property. Miss Ashworth, what is the meaning of this? Who authorized this intrusion?" Miss Ashworth drew herself up, finding courage in her conviction. "I authorized it, Mr. Blackwood. I have engaged Mr. Sherlock Holmes to investigate the troubles that have befallen our society. Surely you cannot object to taking action when our chairman lies unconscious in hospital and our volunteers fear for their safety." "I object to bringing in charlatans and sensation seekers," Blackwood retorted, his color deepening. "These so-called troubles are nothing more than coincidence and superstition. Mr. Pemberton suffered a heart condition. The doctors have said as much. Young Reeves likely had too much to drink and injured himself in a fall. There is no curse, no phantom, no mystery requiring the attention of a consulting detective." Holmes had been observing Blackwood with that still intensity that Watson knew preceded pointed questions. "You are remarkably certain of your position, Mr. Blackwood, for someone who has not witnessed the events in question. Have you perhaps information that others lack, some knowledge that allows you to dismiss so confidently what frightens your fellow volunteers?" The question landed with precision, and Watson saw Blackwood's expression shift, anger giving way momentarily to something that might have been unease before the bluster reasserted itself. "I have common sense, sir, which appears to be in short supply. I will not stand by and watch this society's reputation destroyed by ghost stories and gothic nonsense. We do serious work here, helping real people with real needs. We cannot afford to have our name associated with supernatural investigations and tabloid headlines." "No one has mentioned involving the press," Holmes observed mildly, an interesting concern to raise unprompted. "Tell me, Mr. Blackwood, when did you last visit the attic?" The question hung in the dusty air, and Watson watched the treasurer's face carefully, seeing the slight tightening around the eyes, the momentary pause before answering. "I cannot recall specifically. Months ago, perhaps longer. There is rarely cause to go up there. And yet the dust on the stairs suggests recent traffic, more than Miss Ashworth's single visit to show us Sir Reginald's trunk," Holmes said, his voice still mild, but his words pointed as scalpels. "Someone has been in that attic regularly, Mr. Blackwood. Someone who knew what was stored there, who had reason to examine Sir Reginald's effects, who perhaps found inspiration in the old man's writings about judgment and retribution." The silence that followed Holmes's observation stretched like cold treacle, thick and uncomfortable, filling the warehouse with a tension that made even the distant sounds of the docks seem to retreat. Blackwood's face had progressed through several shades of red, settling finally on a dangerous crimson that suggested either genuine outrage or the performance of it, and Watson found himself unable to determine which with certainty. The treasurer's hands had clenched into fists at his sides, his breathing audible in the quiet space, while Miss Ashworth stood frozen between them, her lamp casting wild shadows as her hand trembled slightly. "How dare you?" Blackwood finally managed, his voice emerging as a low growl that might have been more threatening had it not carried an undertone of something else, fear, perhaps, or desperation. "You come into our warehouse, paw through private property, and within an hour you are making accusations against a man who has devoted years to charitable service. I have half a mind to summon the constabulary and have you removed for trespassing." Holmes regarded him with the calm detachment of a naturalist observing an interesting specimen. "You are, of course, free to do so, though I wonder how you would explain your agitation over a simple question about attic visits. An innocent man might respond with curiosity or mild annoyance, not this theatrical outrage. You protest too much, Mr. Blackwood, which is itself a form of confession." Watson moved slightly, positioning himself where he could intervene if Blackwood's anger progressed to physical action, though the treasurer seemed more inclined toward bluster than violence. Miss Ashworth found her voice, stepping forward with a courage Watson had to admire, her small frame nevertheless conveying authority as she addressed Blackwood. "Horace, please, if you have nothing to hide, then surely you can answer Mr. Holmes's questions without such defensiveness. We are all concerned for the society's welfare. If there is information you possess that might help resolve these troubles, you must share it, regardless of personal feelings about Mr. Holmes's methods." Blackwood's gaze swung to her, and some of the fight seemed to drain from him, his shoulders sagging slightly beneath his heavy coat. He drew a long breath, released it slowly, and when he spoke again, his tone had modulated to something approaching reasonableness, though suspicion still edged his words. "Very well. Yes, I have been in the attic more recently than I initially indicated. 2 weeks ago, I went up to search for old financial records from Sir Reginald's time. Our current audit required documentation of the warehouse's transfer to the society, and I knew Sir Reginald kept meticulous records. While searching, I happened upon his trunk and looked through it briefly out of curiosity. I saw the journals, the costume, the various oddities the old man collected. I thought nothing of it at the time." "Did you read any of the journals?" Holmes asked, his tone now conversational, the confrontational edge smoothed away as though it had never existed. Blackwood hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "A few pages, though his handwriting defeated me for the most part. What I could decipher seemed to be religious ramblings, nothing of consequence. I returned the items to the trunk and found the records I needed elsewhere. That was the entirety of my interaction with Sir Reginald's effects." "And you mentioned this to no one?" Watson interjected, his curiosity genuinely engaged now. "Why would I? It seemed irrelevant to our current operations. Sir Reginald died 30 years ago. His eccentricities are hardly matters of ongoing concern." Blackwood had regained some of his composure, his color returning to a more normal hue, though his discomfort remained evident in the way he shifted his weight, unable to find a comfortable stance. Holmes had begun to pace, his movements slow and thoughtful, his eyes on the warehouse floor, as though reading some text written in the grain of the wood. "Let us consider the sequence of events with this new information in mind. 2 weeks ago, you discover Sir Reginald's trunk and examine its contents. 1 week later, the phantom appearances begin. The timing is suggestive, would you not agree?" "Suggestive of what?" Blackwood demanded, though his voice lacked its earlier force. "That I donned a dusty costume and began haunting our own warehouse. To what possible purpose? I am the treasurer, for heaven's sake. I have access to all our funds legitimately. If I wished to steal from the society, I would not need to create elaborate theatrical displays to do so. Unless theft is not the primary motive," Holmes replied, stopping his pacing to face Blackwood directly. "Consider instead that someone wishes to destroy the society entirely, not merely to enrich themselves, but to eliminate the organization from existence. The phantom, the curse, the mounting fears, all serve to drive away volunteers, halt donations, create an atmosphere of dread that will inevitably lead to the society's dissolution. Who benefits from such an outcome?" The question hung between them, and Watson watched comprehension dawn on Miss Ashworth's face, her eyes widening as implications arranged themselves into pattern. "The property," she breathed. "The warehouse itself. In Sir Reginald's will, if the society ceases to operate, the building reverts to his estate to be sold with proceeds going to his heirs. I had forgotten that provision. It seemed so unlikely to ever matter." "And who are Sir Reginald's heirs?" Holmes asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. Miss Ashworth turned to Blackwood, her face a mixture of dawning horror and disbelief. "Your wife, Horace. Your wife is Sir Reginald's great-niece, his only surviving relation. If the society collapses, this warehouse, worth a small fortune given its location and size, passes to her, to you." Blackwood's face had gone from red to gray, the color draining as though someone had opened a tap. He staggered slightly, reaching out to steady himself against a nearby crate, his breathing ragged. "No," he said, the word emerging as barely more than a whisper. "No, you cannot think. Eleanor, I swear to you, I have done nothing. Yes, my wife would inherit, but I would never, could never commit such acts. I have given years to this society. These people are my friends, my colleagues. How could you believe me capable of such betrayal?" Watson found himself moved despite his suspicions, for the man's distress seemed genuine, his anguish too raw to be mere performance. Holmes, however, remained impassive, his analytical gaze fixed on Blackwood with unwavering intensity. I do not yet believe anything with certainty, Holmes said carefully. I merely follow the evidence where it leads, and at present it leads in your direction. However, I am not a man who leaps to conclusions. There are questions that remain unanswered, inconsistencies that trouble me. If you are innocent, Mr. Blackwood, then someone else knows of your connection to Sir Reginald's estate and seeks to cast suspicion upon you while pursuing their own agenda. If you are guilty, then you are either remarkably clumsy in your execution or remarkably clever in creating the appearance of clumsiness. In either case, the truth will emerge, and sooner than you might think. Holmes turned to Miss Ashworth, his manner becoming almost gentle. I need you to provide me with a complete list of everyone who has keys to this warehouse, everyone who knows the layout intimately, everyone who might have reason to wish the society harm. Include former volunteers, dismissed employees, anyone with whom the society has had disputes or difficulties. Can you prepare such a list by this evening? Miss Ashworth nodded, though she appeared shaken by the revelations of the past few minutes. Yes, of course. I keep detailed records of all our personnel, past and present. I can have it ready within a few hours. Excellent. Watson, I believe we have gathered sufficient information for now. Mr. Blackwood, I suggest you remain available for further questions and perhaps reflect carefully on any detail you may have omitted from your account. The smallest observation might prove crucial. Holmes collected the journals and the carved box he had set aside earlier, wrapping them carefully in cloth that Miss Ashworth provided. We shall return this evening to examine the warehouse after dark. Often things reveal themselves in darkness that remain hidden in daylight. They departed the warehouse into fog that had somehow thickened further, transforming afternoon into perpetual twilight, the world reduced to the few feet of pavement immediately visible, and sounds that emerged, disembodied from the gray blankness. A cart materialized suddenly, its horse's head appearing like something from mythology before the rest followed, the driver's voice calling something unintelligible as he passed. Watson stayed close to Holmes, using his friend's confident navigation through the murk as a guide, though he had no idea how Holmes maintained his sense of direction in such conditions. They walked in silence for some time, the fog pressing around them like an additional layer of clothing, damp and clinging. Finally, Watson spoke, keeping his voice low, though there seemed little chance of being overheard in the muffling gray. Do you truly believe Blackwood is our phantom? Holmes was quiet for a moment, his profile barely visible in the shifting fog. I believe Blackwood knows more than he has revealed, but whether he is our principal actor or merely a supporting player remains to be determined. His discovery of the trunk is almost certainly relevant, but consider this, Watson. If Blackwood wished to destroy the society for financial gain, would he not be more subtle? His connection to Sir Reginald's estate is a matter of record. Any serious investigation would uncover it immediately, casting suspicion upon him, as indeed it has. Either he is foolish, which his management of the society's finances suggests he is not, or he is being framed by someone who wishes him to appear guilty. The mysterious Mr. Flagg, perhaps? Watson suggested, recalling Miss Ashworth's mention of the disgruntled former volunteer. Perhaps, or someone else entirely. Someone whose motive we have not yet perceived. We must also consider that the curse, such as it is, may be serving multiple purposes simultaneously, destroying the society, yes, but also settling personal grievances, eliminating rivals, perhaps even pursuing some genuinely held belief in supernatural justice. Sir Reginald's writings suggest he took these matters quite seriously. What if someone else shares that conviction? They had reached a wider street where gas lamps created islands of sickly yellow light in the fog. A cab materialized from the murk, its driver hunched and miserable looking on his perch, and Holmes hailed it with a sharp whistle. They climbed inside gratefully, settling into seats worn smooth by countless passengers, and Holmes provided the Baker Street address before the cab lurched into motion, its wheels grinding over cobblestones made treacherous by the damp. Watson found himself studying the wrapped bundle of journals in Holmes's lap, wondering what secrets they might contain, what insights into Sir Reginald's troubled mind might shed light on current events. Will you read them all this afternoon? I shall make a start, Holmes replied, his fingers already absently exploring the wrapping, as though impatient to begin. Sir Reginald's obsession with Christmas judgment is the key, I am convinced. Someone has absorbed his ideas and transformed them from philosophical speculation into theatrical reality. Whether that person believes genuinely in supernatural retribution or merely finds it a convenient cover for more mundane motives, we shall discover. But first, we must understand what Sir Reginald believed, what he feared, what he perhaps intended but never accomplished. The cab carried them through streets Watson could not identify, the fog transforming familiar London into terra incognita, until finally they emerged onto a thoroughfare he recognized. And shortly thereafter, the cab drew up before the familiar door of 221 B. Baker Street. They paid the driver and ascended to their rooms, where Mrs. Hudson had kept the fire burning and tea waiting, creating an oasis of warmth and normalcy that felt almost miraculous after the cold strangeness of the warehouse and the fog-shrouded streets. Holmes immediately settled into his chair, unwrapping the journals and opening the first with the careful reverence of a scholar approaching a rare manuscript. Watson poured tea for them both, then took his own chair, content for the moment to watch his friend read, to observe the play of expressions across that remarkable face as Holmes encountered whatever Sir Reginald Thorne had recorded in his final years. The rain had resumed outside, a soft counterpoint to the fire's crackle, and the room fell into that comfortable silence that can only exist between friends who need not fill every moment with speech. After perhaps an hour, Holmes looked up, his expression troubled in a way that Watson rarely witnessed. "Watson, listen to this passage." Sir Reginald writes, "The Christmas tribunal sits not in any earthly court, but in the hearts of those who have sinned against charity's sacred law. The judge wears no robes but the red suit of Father Christmas, transformed from symbol of giving to embodiment of reckoning. Those who give with false hearts, who use compassion as coin for pride, who take from those they claim to serve, these shall face judgment when the Christmas bells toll midnight, and their punishment shall be measured by their transgression. I have prepared the way, I have consecrated the space. When I am gone, the tribunal shall sit in my stead, carried forward by one who understands, who sees clearly, who will serve justice, though the heavens fall." Watson set down his teacup, a chill running through him that had nothing to do with the December cold. Good Lord, he actually believed he was establishing some sort of supernatural legal system? He was quite mad. Mad, perhaps, or perhaps experiencing that peculiar clarity that sometimes accompanies terminal illness, when the usual boundaries between reason and faith become permeable, Holmes mused. But more disturbing is this phrase, carried forward by one who understands. Sir Reginald expected someone to continue his work after his death. He was not merely recording private fantasies, but creating instructions, a legacy to be enacted by a successor. The question becomes, who did he have in mind, and has that person only now decided to fulfill Sir Reginald's vision? The afternoon dissolved into evening as Holmes continued his examination of Sir Reginald's journals, occasionally reading passages aloud when something particularly struck him, while Watson attended to correspondence and tried unsuccessfully to focus on a medical article that had arrived in the Morning Post. The words seemed to slip away from comprehension, his mind returning persistently to the image of the phantom Father Christmas wandering through a dark warehouse, that figure from childhood comfort transformed into something unsettling, an inversion of everything the symbol represented. Outside, darkness came early, as it always did in December, the fog becoming absolute blackness, punctuated only by the occasional glow of a street lamp struggling against the gloom. Mrs. Hudson brought dinner on a tray, a hearty stew with dumplings, warm bread, apple tart for after, and they ate largely in silence. Holmes's attention divided between his food and the journals spread across the side table, annotating pages with slips of paper, creating some system of cross-reference comprehensible only to himself. Watson found the stew comforting, its warmth spreading through him and dulling the edge of the unease that had settled over his thoughts since their warehouse visit. The normality of good food and familiar surroundings provided an anchor against the strangeness of the case, a reminder that beneath all mysteries lay ordinary human needs and comforts. By 7 o'clock, Holmes had finished his preliminary examination and sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic pose of deep contemplation. Watson had given up any pretense of reading and simply watched his friend, waiting for whatever conclusions had been forming through the afternoon's study to finally emerge into speech. Sir Reginald was not mad in the conventional sense, Holmes began without preamble, his voice thoughtful and measured. His writings show a systematic, if deeply unusual, theology. He believed that Christmas had been corrupted from its original purpose, that charity had become a form of social currency rather than genuine compassion, that the wealthy gave not from love, but from pride and the desire for recognition. The Christmas tribunal, he envisioned, was meant to restore authentic giving, to punish those who perverted charity into self-aggrandizement. Watson shifted in his chair, intrigued despite himself. But surely most charity, even if motivated partly by pride, still accomplishes good. The hungry are fed regardless of the giver's inner purity. Precisely the argument a rational mind would make, Holmes agreed. But Sir Reginald had moved beyond rational calculation. He had become a purist, an absolutist. In his view, impure charity was worse than no charity at all because it corrupted the very concept of compassion, reducing sacred obligation to social performance. He believed such corruption accumulated spiritual debt that demanded settlement. Holmes reached for one of the journals, opening it to a marked page. He writes here about specific individuals, donors to various charities who he believed gave only for social standing or business advantage. He catalogs their sins with remarkable detail. Mr. So-and-so, who donated generously to an orphanage while simultaneously evicting tenants from his properties for inability to pay rent. Lady such-and-such, who hosted elaborate charity balls but treated her own servants with cruelty. He names the London Charitable Christmas Society, specifically Watson, though it did not yet exist by that name. He donated the warehouse to create an instrument of judgment, a stage upon which the Christmas tribunal could manifest and expose those who gave with false hearts. Watson felt his eyebrows rise. He created the charity specifically to judge it? That seems perversely circular. "Welcome to the labyrinth of Sir Reginald's theology," Holmes said with a slight smile that held no humor. But here is where matters become even more intriguing. In his final entries, written apparently just weeks before his death, he mentions someone, a person he refers to only as the witness. This individual, according to Sir Reginald, possessed the sight necessary to perceive spiritual corruption, the conviction to pursue justice regardless of earthly consequence, and the courage to serve the Christmas tribunal after Sir Reginald himself had passed beyond the veil. Holmes closed the journal and fixed Watson with an intense gaze. Sir Reginald was not simply recording private visions, Watson. He was recruiting an accomplice, preparing someone to enact his vision of judgment after his death. The phantom we seek is not merely using Sir Reginald's costume and ideas. This person may believe themselves to be carrying out a sacred mission, fulfilling an obligation to a mentor or master. We are dealing not with simple fraud or even elaborate revenge, but with genuine zealotry. The weight of this realization settled over the room like a physical presence. Watson found himself glancing toward the windows, suddenly conscious of the darkness beyond the glass, the fog that could hide any number of watching eyes. Did Sir Reginald identify this witness, give any indication of their identity? Not explicitly, though there are hints scattered throughout the later journals. The witness is described as having suffered injustice, as understanding poverty and desperation from personal experience, as possessing education despite humble origins. Sir Reginald mentions teaching this person, sharing knowledge, preparing them for their role. The relationship appears to have been mentor and student, perhaps even surrogate father and child, given the language used. Holmes stood, beginning to pace as he often did when thoughts moved too quickly for stillness. The witness could be anyone who knew Sir Reginald in his final years, a servant, a clerk, a distant relation, perhaps even Blackwood himself, though the descriptions do not quite fit his circumstances. We need more information about Sir Reginald's household, his associates, the people who surrounded him before his death 30 years ago. Would such records still exist? Watson asked doubtfully. 30 years is a considerable span. Sir Reginald's solicitors might retain records, assuming the firm still operates. His will, his estate documents, correspondence, these things are often preserved. Tomorrow we shall pursue that avenue, but tonight we have an appointment at the warehouse. Miss Ashworth expects us after dark, and I am most curious to observe the building when our phantom might feel emboldened to appear. Within the hour, they had prepared themselves for the evening's expedition. Heavy coats against the cold, dark lanterns that could be shuttered to hide their presence. Watson's revolver loaded and secured in his pocket as a precaution. They descended to the street where the fog still reigned, perhaps even thicker than before, a nearly solid wall of gray-white that reduced the world to arm's length and muffled all sounds into a ghostly remoteness. Holmes had telegraphed ahead to secure a cab, and they found it waiting, the driver a stolid figure who seemed unbothered by the weather, his horse patient in its traces. The journey to the docks seemed to take twice as long as their afternoon trip, the cab moving slowly through streets where other vehicles appeared suddenly from the fog like materializing spirits, where pedestrians became visible only at the last moment, forcing the driver to navigate with extraordinary caution. Watson found the ride oddly dreamlike, the cab's interior a small island of relative warmth and solidity, while outside the world had dissolved into gray chaos. Holmes sat in characteristic silence, his face barely visible in the dim light that filtered through the fog, his expression turned inward as he no doubt reviewed the evidence and formulated plans for the evening's investigation. They arrived at last, the warehouse materializing gradually from the fog, its bulk darker than the surrounding darkness, its windows like empty eye sockets in a skull. The cab departed after Holmes arranged for its return in 2 hours, and they stood alone in the fog-shrouded street, listening to the muffled sounds of the dock district. Distant voices, the creak of ship rigging, water lapping at pilings, all made strange and directionless by the fog. Miss Ashworth had left the side door unlocked, as arranged, and they entered quietly, Holmes lighting his dark lantern only after ensuring the door was closed behind them. The beam cut through the warehouse's interior darkness, revealing familiar shapes transformed by nighttime into something slightly sinister, the stacked crates and barrels becoming crouching figures, the hanging tools and ropes suggesting instruments of some unpleasant purpose, shadows gathering in corners with almost tangible density. "We should position ourselves where we can observe without being easily seen," Holmes whispered, his voice barely audible even in the close silence. The loading dock area would provide good vantage, elevated and with views of both the main floor and the stairs to the upper levels. They made their way carefully through the darkness, Watson following Holmes's lead, their footsteps muffled by their careful placement, but still seeming loud in the empty space. They reached the loading dock and settled into position behind some crates that provided both concealment and a reasonable view of the warehouse interior. Holmes shuttered his lantern completely, and darkness rushed in to reclaim the space, so absolute that Watson could not see his own hand before his face. Time became difficult to measure in the darkness and silence. Watson's eyes gradually adjusted until he could perceive the faint gray rectangles of the high windows, the subtle variations in the quality of darkness that suggested shapes and spaces. His hearing became acute, detecting the building's small sounds, settling wood, the whisper of wind finding gaps in the walls, distant noises from the street that might have been real or imagined. He found himself thinking of the phantom, wondering if they would actually see it, whether it would appear as described, the red suit, the matted beard, those cold, empty eyes. An hour might have passed, perhaps more, when Holmes's hand suddenly gripped Watson's arm in warning. Watson froze, straining his senses, and then he heard it. A sound from somewhere above, a soft creak that might have been a footstep on the attic floor. Another creak, then silence, then the unmistakable sound of the attic stairs groaning under weight as someone descended. Holmes unshuttered his lantern slightly, providing just enough light to see by, and they watched the stairway entrance with absolute focus. A figure emerged from the darkness of the stairwell, and Watson felt his breath catch despite his rational mind's protests. The figure wore the red suit, the white trimmed coat visible even in the dim light, the long white beard catching what little illumination existed. It moved with strange deliberateness, carrying the large sack over one shoulder, and even from their concealed position, Watson could feel something wrong about it, some quality that transcended costume into something genuinely unsettling. The figure moved across the warehouse floor, seeming to glide rather than walk, making almost no sound despite its apparent bulk. It approached the area where donations were sorted, setting down the sack and beginning to move items. Watson could see crates being opened, their contents examined and sometimes removed, placed into the sack with methodical efficiency. The theft was brazen, unhurried, suggesting either remarkable confidence or genuine belief in supernatural protection. Holmes had tensed beside Watson, every muscle coiled for action, and Watson knew his friend was cataloging every detail, the figure's height and build, its movements and habits, any identifying characteristics that might penetrate the disguise. They watched in silence for perhaps 5 minutes, and then Holmes made his decision, rising from their concealment and calling out in a voice that rang through the warehouse like a gunshot. "Good evening, Father Christmas. I believe you and I should have a conversation about Sir Reginald Thorne and the Christmas Tribunal." The figure froze at Holmes's voice, its stillness so absolute it might have been a statue rather than a living person, and for a long moment the warehouse held its breath, balanced on the edge of flight or confrontation. Watson had drawn his revolver, keeping it ready but not yet aimed, positioned slightly behind and to the side of Holmes to provide coverage should the situation turn violent. The lamplight created a strange tableau, Holmes standing tall and commanding on the loading dock, the costumed figure caught in its theft below, shadows dancing across both as the flame flickered slightly in some draft that whispered through the vast space. Then the figure moved, but not in the direction Watson expected. Instead of fleeing or attacking, it straightened slowly, turning to face them fully, and even through the artifice of beard and costume, Watson detected something in the posture that suggested neither fear nor aggression, but rather a kind of weary resignation, as though this confrontation had been anticipated and perhaps even welcomed. When the figure spoke, the voice emerged oddly muffled by the false beard, but distinctly feminine, carrying an accent that spoke of education, overlaid on working-class London origins. "You are the detective, then, Miss Ashworth's great hope for salvation." The figure reached up and removed the beard with practiced motion, revealing a woman's face, middle-aged, careworn but handsome, with dark eyes that blazed with an intensity Watson recognized as fanaticism barely held in check. I wondered when someone would finally see clearly enough to look beyond the obvious. Most people accept their reality without question, never thinking to examine the foundations upon which their certainties rest. Holmes descended from the loading dock with fluid grace, moving closer but maintaining a careful distance, his manner somehow conveying both authority and a strange respect. "You were Sir Reginald's witness, the one he prepared for this role. May I know your name?" The woman smiled, though the expression held no warmth. "I was Charlotte Thorne when Sir Reginald took me in. Now, I am simply the instrument of judgment he created, the servant of truth he trained to see what others refuse to acknowledge. My name is no longer relevant to my purpose." "Charlotte Thorne," Holmes repeated thoughtfully. "A relation, then? Daughter? Niece?" "Nothing so respectable," she replied, her voice carrying bitter amusement. "I was born Charlotte Wickham, the bastard daughter of Sir Reginald's younger brother and a seamstress he seduced and abandoned. My mother died when I was 12, leaving me to survive on the streets, scavenging and begging and learning exactly how little the wealthy care for those who fall between society's cracks. Sir Reginald found me when I was 15, starving and desperate, stealing from the very warehouse we now stand in when it still served his shipping business." She moved slowly as she spoke, her hands visible and empty, the theatrical quality of her costume at odds with the raw honesty in her voice. Watson found himself simultaneously alert for danger and oddly moved by her narrative, recognizing the tragedy that so often lay behind criminal action. "He could have turned me over to the constables," Charlotte continued, her eyes fixed on Holmes with laser intensity. "Instead, he took me into his household, not as a servant, but as something between ward and student. He educated me. Literature, history, philosophy, languages. He spoke to me as an equal, perhaps the only person who ever has, and he taught me to see the truth behind charity's mask, to perceive the corruption that festers beneath society's pious pretensions." Holmes had been listening with complete focus, his expression neutral, but his attention absolute. "He taught you about the Christmas Tribunal. He prepared you to continue his work after his death." "He showed me reality," Charlotte corrected, her voice rising slightly. "He revealed how the wealthy use charity to purchase absolution for their cruelties. how organizations like this society exist not to help the poor, but to make the rich feel virtuous without actually changing the systems that create poverty. He showed me account books documenting donors who gave hundreds to Christmas charities while paying their workers starvation wages. He introduced me to women who organized charity balls while their husbands operated slums where children died of preventable diseases. He taught me that false charity is worse than no charity because it perpetuates the illusion that the system functions. But surely even imperfect charity provides some relief. The food distributed by this society still feeds hungry people, regardless of the donor's motivations. Charlotte turned her fierce gaze on him, and Watson felt the full force of her conviction. Relief that ensures continued subjugation, Doctor. Food that keeps workers alive enough to continue their exploitation but never sufficient to allow them to escape their circumstances. Sir Reginald understood what most refuse to acknowledge, that this society, like so many others, exists to manage poverty, not to eliminate it, to make suffering bearable enough that revolution never comes. And so you decided to destroy it, Holmes stated, not questioning, but confirming. Using Sir Reginald's costume and his theology to create an atmosphere of supernatural dread that would force the society's dissolution. Charlotte's smile returned, cold and certain. I am executing judgment, Mr. Holmes. The Christmas tribunal sits not in my person, but in the truth I reveal. Consider what I have actually done. I have taken only from those who gave falsely, touching not a penny of legitimate donation. I have frightened only those whose consciences already knew their guilt. I have cursed only those who deserved cursing. Young Thomas Reeves, for instance, who volunteered here not from compassion, but to impress a young woman he hoped to seduce. His injury was his own clumsiness fleeing from confrontation with his shallow motives. And Mr. Pemberton? Holmes asked quietly. The chairman who lies unconscious in hospital? For the first time, Charlotte's certainty seemed to waver, a flicker of something that might have been regret crossing her features. His collapse was unfortunate, but not undeserved. Pemberton has embezzled from this society for years, small amounts carefully hidden in accounting irregularities. Sir Reginald's journals documented his suspicions, and my own investigations confirmed them. The stress of facing exposure caused his heart to fail. That is not my sin, but his own. Holmes had begun to pace, moving in a slow circle around Charlotte, not threatening but clearly thinking through implications and possibilities. You have been living here in the warehouse, the attic presumably, where you could access Sir Reginald's costume and journals, where you could observe the society's operations unseen. I have nowhere else, Charlotte said simply, the defiance in her voice giving way momentarily to something more vulnerable. When Sir Reginald died, his legitimate family took everything, the house, the business, the fortune. I was cast out with nothing, not even the education he had given me, counting for anything in a world that requires both credentials and connections. I have survived these 30 years by my wits and will, taking work where I could find it, always watching, always remembering what Sir Reginald taught me. When I learned his warehouse had been given to this society, when I understood the bitter irony of his charitable donation being used to create the very organization he most despised, I knew my purpose had been revealed. I came here 6 months ago, hiding in the spaces this building contains, learning its rhythms, preparing for the time when I would finally execute the judgment Sir Reginald intended. Watson felt an unexpected surge of sympathy for this woman, twisted though her methods were. He saw in her story the familiar tragedy of intelligence and potential crushed by circumstance, of rage at injustice curdled into destructive action. Yet sympathy could not excuse the harm she had caused, the fear she had deliberately cultivated, the theft and assault that marked her campaign. Holmes had stopped his pacing, standing now directly before Charlotte, and when he spoke, his voice carried an unusual gentleness. You believe you are serving justice, executing a righteous judgment against corruption and hypocrisy. But consider, Charlotte, Sir Reginald's vision was born from isolation and illness, from a mind that had lost proportion and balance. His theology of punishment may have felt true to him, may have given meaning to his final days, but it remains the construction of one troubled man, not divine revelation. You have devoted your life to fulfilling a dead man's obsession, sacrificing your own possibilities to serve his ghost. Charlotte's eyes glistened with sudden moisture, though whether from anger or sorrow, Watson could not determine. You speak of possibilities as though I ever possessed them. You speak as a man who has never truly been hungry, never been invisible to those who control society's levers. Sir Reginald saw me when no one else did. He valued me when the world deemed me worthless. If serving his vision is obsession, then it is an obsession that gave my life meaning when meaning had been stripped away. I understand, Holmes said, and Watson believed he genuinely did. That peculiar empathy that occasionally broke through his rational detachment, allowing him to perceive the human truth beneath the criminal act. But understanding cannot prevent consequence. You have committed theft, assault, and destruction of property. The law recognizes motivation, but does not excuse action based on philosophical conviction. You must face accountability for what you have done. Charlotte laughed, the sound bitter and exhausted. The law, that instrument of the powerful used to constrain the desperate. Do you truly believe I fear legal consequence, Mr. Holmes? I have already been judged and sentenced by a system that values property over people, that punishes poverty while rewarding exploitation. Your law holds no terror for one who has nothing left to lose. She moved suddenly, not toward them, but toward the warehouse's main door, her hand reaching into the sack she had been filling. Watson raised his revolver instinctively, but Charlotte withdrew only a small object, the carved wooden box Holmes had taken from Sir Reginald's trunk. You removed this, but I have others. Sir Reginald created several, each containing talismans meant to consecrate the spaces where judgment would be enacted. I have placed them throughout this warehouse, in the walls, beneath the floors, in places you will never find without tearing the building apart. This structure now belongs to the Christmas Tribunal. It can never again serve false charity. Even if you stop me, even if the society continues, this place will remember judgment. Those who work here will feel it, an invisible weight on their conscience, a whisper that questions every motive and exposes every hypocrisy. Holmes had tensed, recognizing the shift in Charlotte's energy, the quality of someone who had made a final decision and found strange peace in its inevitability. Charlotte, whatever you are planning, consider carefully. Your life need not end in violence or tragedy. There are alternatives, possibilities you have not yet imagined. My life ended 30 years ago when Sir Reginald died and his family discarded me like rubbish, Charlotte replied, her voice steady despite the tears now flowing freely down her weathered face. Everything since has been merely execution of duty, fulfillment of purpose. I have completed what I came to do. The society's reputation is destroyed, its operations halted, its future uncertain. Judgment has been rendered. What happens to me now is irrelevant to the truth that has been revealed. She reached into her costume, and Watson's finger tightened on his revolver's trigger. But what emerged was not a weapon, but a letter, sealed with red wax. For Miss Ashworth. She deserves to know the full truth about Pemberton's embezzlement, about Blackwood's wife's inheritance rights, about the donors whose names I have documented and whose corruption I have catalogued. Let her decide what to do with that knowledge. Let her choose whether to rebuild this society on honest foundations or to let it die and begin something new, something genuine. Charlotte placed the letter carefully on a nearby crate, her movements deliberate and almost ceremonial, as though this final act carried weight beyond the simple transfer of paper and ink. The warehouse around them seemed to hold its breath, the shadows pressing close while the lamp's flame burned steady, casting its small circle of light against the vast darkness. Holmes had not moved, his attention fixed on Charlotte with that intensity Watson recognized as calculation mixed with genuine human concern, weighing options and outcomes with the speed that characterized his remarkable mind. "The letter can wait," Holmes said, his tone remaining gentle but firm. "What cannot wait is deciding what happens next, in the immediate moments we now occupy. You have committed crimes, yes, but circumstances provide context that any reasonable magistrate would consider. Sir Reginald's manipulation of a desperate child, your abandonment by his family, 30 years of survival without support or opportunity, these matters would be heard and weighed. Prison might be avoided entirely in favor of treatment, rehabilitation, a chance to build an actual life rather than serving as instrument to a dead man's damaged vision." Charlotte smiled sadly, shaking her head with a resignation that chilled Watson more than her earlier defiance had. "You are kind to offer hope, Mr. Holmes, but you misunderstand my situation entirely. I am not seeking escape or redemption. I have done what I came to do, fulfilled the purpose that gave my existence meaning. What remains is simply conclusion, the natural ending of a story that began the night Sir Reginald found a starving girl stealing bread from his warehouse." She moved toward the main door, and Holmes moved with her, not blocking her path, but maintaining proximity, clearly reluctant to let her leave, but equally reluctant to force confrontation that might turn violent. Watson followed, his revolver lowered but ready, his doctor's instincts detecting something in Charlotte's manner that suggested decisions made beyond their ability to influence, a quality of farewell that transcended the immediate moment. "Where will you go?" Holmes asked, genuine curiosity mixing with concern. "Even if you leave now, your identity is known, your actions documented. There is nowhere in London you could hide that I could not eventually find you." "I am not hiding, Mr. Holmes. I am simply completing the circle." Charlotte paused at the door, her hand on the latch, turning to face them one final time. "You asked earlier if Sir Reginald identified his witness in his journals. He did in his very last entry, written the night before he died. He wrote, 'The witness will know herself by the mark I have given her, the sign that confirms her election and consecrates her purpose. When judgment is complete, when the Christmas tribunal has rendered its verdict, the witness must return to where everything began, to the water that washes away all accounts and settles all debts. Only then will the circle close and the pattern fulfill itself.'" Watson felt understanding dawn like cold sunrise. "The river. You mean to go to the river?" Charlotte's smile broadened slightly, acknowledging the correctness of his deduction. "The Thames has always been London's great equalizer, has it not? It takes everything we give it, our waste, our dead, our secrets, and transforms them into something beyond judgment or categorization." Sir Reginald understood its significance. He was found beside it on the morning of his death, though whether he meant to enter or merely to contemplate, no one ever knew. "I have always understood that my ending would mirror his beginning of the tribunal's work." Holmes had gone very still, his face showing the conflict between professional duty and human compassion that occasionally troubled even his rational calculations. "Charlotte, I cannot allow you to harm yourself. Whatever you believe Sir Reginald intended, whatever meaning you have constructed from his words, your life possesses value independent of his vision. You are not merely his instrument. You are a person with agency and possibility that extends beyond the boundaries he drew." "Am I?" Charlotte asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "I wonder sometimes what I might have been without Sir Reginald's intervention. Would I have died on the streets at 16? Would I have found some other path, built some other life? The question is unanswerable and therefore irrelevant. I am what he made me, and I have done what he prepared me to do. There is completion in that, Mr. Holmes. There is peace in fulfilling one's purpose, even if that purpose appears twisted to others." She opened the door, and fog rushed in like a living thing, swirling around her red-suited figure, transforming her once again into something between reality and symbol. "Do not follow me. You cannot stop what I have set in motion, and attempting to do so will only prolong suffering without changing outcome. Read my letter to Miss Ashworth. Help her understand that the society need not die, but must transform, must become something honest if it is to continue. That is the real judgment, not destruction, but the demand for truth." Holmes stepped forward, his hand reaching out as though to physically restrain her, but Charlotte had already moved into the fog, her figure dissolving almost instantly into the gray-white blankness, leaving only the sound of footsteps receding into distance and then silence. Holmes stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, and Watson saw the struggle playing across his features, the impulse to pursue warring with uncertainty about the wisdom of such action, the detective's need to solve and prevent conflicting with the philosopher's recognition that some choices lie beyond external intervention. "Should we follow?" Watson asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Holmes drew a long breath, then stepped back and closed the door, his expression settling into something between resignation and sorrow. "No, Watson. She moves through fog she knows intimately, through streets where she has survived for 30 years, toward a destination she has clearly prepared for this moment. We would lose her within a block, and even if we did not, what then? Physical restraint, forced hospitalization. We would be imposing our judgment of what her life should be, exactly the paternalism she has spent her existence resisting. But she means to kill herself, Watson protested, his medical oath rebelling against passive acceptance of such intention. Surely we have a moral obligation to prevent that if we can. Do we? Holmes turned to face him, and Watson saw genuine uncertainty in his friend's eyes, that rare acknowledgement of questions without clear answers. By what right do we decide that her assessment of her situation is invalid, that our understanding of her possibilities outweighs her own? She is not mad in any conventional sense, confused perhaps, damaged certainly, but capable of rational thought and autonomous decision. Sir Reginald's corruption of her youth was monstrous, but 30 years have passed. She has had time to reflect, to choose differently, yet she remains committed to this path. At what point does intervention become violation of the very autonomy we claim to protect? Watson had no ready answer, finding himself confronting the uncomfortable edges of his own certainties. The fire of his initial impulse to pursue and prevent had cooled under the water of Holmes's reasoning, leaving only the gray ash of moral ambiguity. They stood together in the silent warehouse, the letter Charlotte had left resting on its crate like an unexploded device, both men grappling with the inadequacy of their respective frameworks, Holmes's logic and Watson's compassion, to fully address the complexity of one damaged woman's choice. "We should read the letter," Holmes finally said, moving toward where Charlotte had left it. "If nothing else, we owe Miss Ashworth the truth Charlotte wished her to know, and perhaps in understanding the full picture of what has occurred here, we will find some measure of clarity about what our response should be." He broke the seal carefully, unfolding several pages covered in neat, precise handwriting that spoke of education and care despite the explosive content it contained. Holmes read silently first, his eyes moving rapidly across the pages, his expression darkening as he progressed. When he finished, he handed the letter to Watson without comment, and Watson read with growing dismay the catalog of corruption and hypocrisy Charlotte had meticulously documented. Pemberton's embezzlement was detailed with accounting precision, years of small thefts hidden in budget manipulations, funds meant for the poor diverted to personal use, all documented with copies of ledgers and receipts Charlotte must have photographed or traced during her months living hidden in the warehouse. Blackwood's situation was more complex, not actively criminal, but revealing knowledge of his wife's inheritance rights, and evidence suggesting he had deliberately allowed the society's reputation to deteriorate, doing nothing to investigate the phantom appearances or support Miss Ashworth's concerns, perhaps hoping the organization would collapse naturally and deliver the valuable property to his household. But the most damning revelations concerned the donors Charlotte had investigated. She had compiled evidence of hypocrisy that would destroy reputations if made public. The wealthy manufacturer who gave generously to Christmas charities while operating factories where children worked 12-hour days in dangerous conditions, the society matron who organized charitable events while her husband's slum properties killed tenants through neglect, the banker who donated to feeding programs while foreclosing on farms and driving families into the very poverty his charity claimed to address. "Good God," Watson breathed, looking up from the pages. If even half of this is accurate, the scandal would be enormous. It would destroy not just this society, but public faith in charitable organizations throughout London. Holmes had retrieved Charlotte's Father Christmas beard from where she had dropped it, turning it over in his hands thoughtfully. All of it is likely accurate. Charlotte spent 30 years observing, learning, documenting. Sir Reginald trained her well, not just in his theology, but in the investigative methods necessary to support accusations with evidence. She has built a case that would convince any jury, assembled proof that cannot be easily dismissed or explained away. "What do we do with it?" Watson asked, the weight of the letter suddenly feeling immense in his hands. "Deliver it to Miss Ashworth as Charlotte intended? Give it to the police? Destroy it and let these crimes remain hidden?" Holmes moved to the warehouse's high windows, staring out into the fog-shrouded darkness as though seeking answers in the impenetrable gray. Each choice carries consequences. Delivering the letter triggers scandal and destruction, but also reveals truth and may prevent future harm. Destroying it protects reputations and institutions, but allows exploitation to continue unchecked. Giving it to police removes the decision from our hands but ensures public exposure with all its attendant damage to innocent people connected to the guilty. He turned back to Watson, his face illuminated from below by the lamp they had brought, shadows collecting in the hollows of his cheeks and beneath his eyes, making him appear almost skeletal in the uncertain light. Charlotte has given us a final test, Watson. She has made us instruments of judgment just as Sir Reginald made her. We must decide whether truth matters more than stability, whether exposure serves justice or merely satisfies revenge, whether the society's flawed charity is better than no charity at all. Watson felt exhaustion settling over him, the weight of the evening's revelations crushing the last reserves of energy he had maintained through tension and adrenaline. Perhaps we should sleep on it. Make no decision tonight while emotions run high and understanding remains incomplete. Morning may bring clarity that eludes us in darkness and fog. Holmes nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in Watson's suggestion even as his own nature resisted delay. Very well. We take the letter, we lock this warehouse, and we return to Baker Street, where fire and tea and familiar walls may restore some measure of perspective. Tomorrow we will speak with Miss Ashworth, perhaps visit the hospital to check on Pemberton's condition, possibly even attempt to contact Blackwood before making any final decisions about what Charlotte's evidence demands of us. They gathered their belongings and prepared to depart, Holmes carefully folding the letter and securing it in an inner pocket. As they moved toward the door, Watson found himself looking around the warehouse one final time, seeing it now through Charlotte's eyes, not as a place of charity, but as a stage for hypocrisy, a mechanism for managing rather than solving poverty, a monument to the failure of compassion when filtered through institutions and self-interest. He could not fully embrace her harsh judgment, but neither could he entirely dismiss it. The fog embraced them as they stepped into the street, and somewhere in its depths, Watson knew, Charlotte Wickham moved toward her appointed ending, carrying with her the twisted legacy of Sir Reginald Thorne's damaged vision. Whether they should have tried harder to stop her, whether her choice deserved respect or intervention, whether her judgment of the society held truth or merely reflected her own distorted perspective, these questions would haunt Watson long after this night ended, adding themselves to the catalog of moral ambiguities that accumulate in any life lived with attention and care. Morning arrived with unexpected clarity, the fog having lifted during the night to reveal London washed clean by rain that had fallen in the small hours, the streets gleaming wetly under pale winter sunlight that seemed almost startling after days of gray obscurity. Watson woke to find Holmes already up and dressed, standing at the window with a telegram in hand, his expression grave in a way that made Watson's stomach tighten even before any words were spoken. The fire had been built up, tea sat steaming on the table, and the normality of these domestic arrangements created jarring contrast with the tension evident in Holmes's bearing. "News from the River Police," Holmes said without preamble as Watson sat up and reached for his dressing gown. A woman's body was recovered from the Thames near London Bridge at dawn. Red velvet clothing, approximate age, and description matching Charlotte Wickham. They request my presence to confirm identification, given my involvement in the warehouse investigation. Watson felt the news settle over him like a physical weight, despite having anticipated precisely this outcome. Knowing something intellectually and confronting its reality remained distinct experiences, separated by the difference between abstraction and flesh. "I will come with you," he said quietly, moving to dress with the automatic efficiency of a man accustomed to responding to medical emergencies at all hours. Within the hour, they stood in the cold, tiled chamber where the river police maintained their morgue, the smell of Thames water and death mixing unpleasantly despite the attendants' attempts at ventilation and cleaning. The body lay on a metal table covered by a sheet that the attendant pulled back at Holmes's nod, revealing Charlotte's face peaceful in death, the lines of struggle and conviction smoothed away by the water's embrace, her gray-white skin suggesting she had been in the river for several hours before discovery. "It is Charlotte Wickham," Holmes confirmed, his voice professionally neutral, though Watson detected the underlying current of regret. The woman known to the London Charitable Christmas Society as their phantom Father Christmas, the woman who called herself Sir Reginald Thorne's witness. The attending officer, a stolid sergeant named Morrison, with the weathered face of a man who had spent decades dealing with the river's grim harvest, made notes in his ledger with a stubby pencil. "No signs of foul play that we can determine. appears to be a deliberate entry. Her pockets were weighted with stones, suggesting intention rather than accident. We found this on her person. He produced a small waterproof pouch, and from it extracted a folded paper, miraculously preserved despite its immersion. Holmes took it carefully, unfolding it to reveal a brief note in Charlotte's precise handwriting. "The accounts are settled. The judgment is complete. Let those who remain choose truth or comfortable lies. That decision is theirs, as this decision was mine. I return to the water that has always claimed London's forgotten. Perhaps there I will find the peace that eluded me in a world that values property over people." Charlotte Wickham, the last and only witness. Watson read over Holmes's shoulder, feeling the finality of those words, the deliberate closure Charlotte had enacted. Whatever else she had been, criminal, zealot, victim of Sir Reginald's manipulation, she had also been a woman of determination and agency, choosing her ending with the same purposeful conviction she had brought to her campaign of judgment. "We will need a full statement from you, Mr. Holmes," Sergeant Morrison said, his tone apologetic but firm. "The circumstances are unusual enough to require thorough documentation. The costume, the connection to the warehouse investigation, the apparent suicide following confrontation with yourself and Dr. Watson, all must be properly recorded." They spent the next 2 hours in a cramped office, providing detailed accounts of the previous evening's events, their discovery of Charlotte's identity, the conversation that had preceded her departure into the fog. Holmes omitted nothing of substance, though Watson noticed he emphasized Charlotte's lucidity and apparent peace with her decision, framing it not as temporary madness but as considered choice, perhaps hoping to spare her memory the stigma of lunacy that might otherwise attach itself to suicide. When they finally emerged back into the pale winter sunlight, both men felt the exhaustion that follows intense emotional experience compounded by lack of sleep. Yet the day's obligations had only begun. Miss Ashworth would need to be informed. Decisions about Charlotte's evidence still required making, and the larger question of the society's future demanded attention. "What will you tell Miss Ashworth?" Watson asked as they walked through streets now busy with morning commerce, the city having shaken off the previous day's fog and returned to its usual bustling self. Holmes was silent for several strides, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze on the pavement before him. The truth, as much as can be safely shared, Charlotte's identity, her history with Sir Reginald, her motivations and methods. But the letter, that requires more careful consideration. We must determine whether the revelations it contains serve justice or merely satisfy vengeance, whether exposure will lead to reform or simply destroy without building anything better in its place. They found Miss Ashworth at the warehouse, attempting to restore some order to the disrupted operations, her face showing the strain of sleepless nights and accumulated worry. She looked up as they entered, hope and dread warring in her expression, clearly reading from their faces that the news they brought carried weight. Holmes delivered the information with his characteristic blend of directness and compassion, sparing her neither the truth of Charlotte's actions nor the tragedy of her history. Miss Ashworth listened in silence, her hands gripping the edge of the desk where she sat, her face cycling through shock, grief, anger, and finally a kind of exhausted sadness that spoke to her fundamental decency. "That poor woman," she said when Holmes finished, her voice barely above a whisper. To carry such pain for so long, to have her potential so thoroughly corrupted by Sir Reginald's twisted vision. And we never knew. None of us suspected that the building itself housed someone who watched our every move, who judged our every action through the lens of her mentor's damaged theology. "She left something for you," Holmes said, producing the letter from his coat. Evidence she compiled regarding various aspects of the Society's operations and its donors. "I have read it, Miss Ashworth, and I must warn you that its contents are disturbing and potentially destructive if made public. Before I give it to you, I need to understand what you intend to do with such information." Miss Ashworth reached for the letter with steady hands despite her obvious emotional turmoil. "I intend to read it, Mr. Holmes, and then I intend to act on whatever it reveals, regardless of personal consequence or public scandal. If Charlotte's accusations are true, if we have been harboring corruption or accepting donations from those whose wealth is built on the suffering our charity claims to alleviate, then I would rather see the society destroyed than continue operating on such compromised foundations." Holmes studied her for a long moment, then placed the letter in her outstretched hand. "I believe you mean that, which is why I am entrusting this to you rather than destroying it or delivering it to authorities. You have demonstrated integrity throughout this affair, Miss Ashworth. Whatever you decide, I trust it will be guided by genuine concern for justice rather than merely protecting institutions or reputations." Miss Ashworth began reading immediately, her expression darkening as she progressed through Charlotte's meticulously documented accusations. Watson watched her face register each revelation: shock at Pemberton's embezzlement, dismay at Blackwood's passive complicity, horror at the evidence of donor hypocrisy. When she finally looked up, tears stood in her eyes, but her voice remained firm. "It is all true. I can see the patterns now that Charlotte has pointed them out. The budget irregularities I attributed to clerical errors, Blackwood's strange reluctance to investigate the Phantom despite his position as treasurer, the donations from individuals whose public generosity masked private cruelty. We have been blind, Mr. Holmes, willfully or otherwise. We accepted the appearance of charity without examining its substance." She set the letter down carefully, as though it were something that might explode if handled roughly. "I will resign my position effective immediately. I will recommend that the board dissolve the society and return the warehouse to Sir Reginald's estate as his will specified, and I will personally contact each donor Charlotte named, informing them that their donations are being returned and their association with the society is terminated. If they wish to sue for defamation, let them. Charlotte's evidence will withstand any legal scrutiny." "That is one approach," Holmes acknowledged, his tone neutral. "But consider an alternative. Use this information not to destroy but to transform. Dismiss Pemberton and Blackwood, certainly. Return the tainted donations, yes, but keep the society operating under new leadership, with new standards, with Charlotte's evidence serving as reminder of what happens when charity becomes performance rather than genuine compassion. Make the society what it should have been from the beginning, an organization that gives not from pride or social obligation, but from actual commitment to reducing suffering." The interior of the cottage revealed itself as they entered, a single large room that served simultaneously as living space, study, and laboratory, its walls lined with makeshift shelving bearing books and manuscripts, scientific apparatus, and stranger items that defied immediate categorization. A fire burned steadily in the stone hearth, providing warmth and flickering light that danced across surfaces crowded with the accumulated evidence of obsessive research. The air held complex scents, old paper and candle wax, herbs and chemicals, and beneath these, a mustier smell that might have been animal or might have been something else entirely, something for which Watson's vocabulary possessed no adequate descriptor. Thornwood gestured them toward chairs arranged near the fire, simple wooden pieces that nevertheless appeared comfortable and well-maintained, suggesting a man who retained appreciation for domestic comfort despite his extraordinary circumstances. He moved to a small table where a kettle sat heating over a spirit lamp and began preparing tea with movements that spoke of ritual, the careful measuring of leaves, the precise attention to water temperature, actions that seemed to ground him in normalcy and provide structure against whatever chaos threatened at the edges of his existence. Holmes settled into his chair with evident interest, his gaze moving systematically around the room, cataloging contents and organization, reading in the arrangement of objects the story of Thornwood's journey from respected academic to isolated experimenter in transformation. Watson positioned himself where he could observe both Thornwood and Holmes, his medical training automatically assessing the scholar's physical condition, noting the tremor in his hands as he poured tea, the hollowness of his cheeks that suggested inadequate nutrition, the darkness around his eyes that spoke of disrupted sleep, or perhaps no sleep at all during certain phases of the lunar cycle. "You have questions," Thornwood said, distributing cups and then seating himself across from them, his posture oddly formal as though they had gathered for an academic colloquium rather than an interview concerning supernatural transformation. "And I have answers, though I confess I am uncertain where to begin, how to convey in language designed for ordinary discourse the nature of experiences that transcend ordinary reality." "Perhaps begin with the manuscripts," Holmes suggested gently, his tone conveying neither judgment nor disbelief, but simple invitation to narrative. "You claim to have discovered texts from the Whitechapel Monastery Library. Were these claims accurate, and if so, what did these texts contain? Thornwood's face transformed as he began to speak, animation replacing the exhausted flatness, his eyes focusing on memories that clearly retained their power to excite and disturb. They were real, Mr. Holmes. More real and more extraordinary than I could have imagined when I first heard rumors of their survival. I traced them through 4 centuries of private ownership, following fragmentary references in estate inventories and auction records, until I finally located them in the collection of an elderly gentleman who had inherited them without understanding their significance or value. He rose and moved to one of the shelves, removing a wooden box bound with iron clasps that showed considerable age. Returning to his seat, he opened the box carefully to reveal several volumes, their leather covers darkened and cracked with time, their pages covered in dense Latin text interspersed with diagrams and symbols that drew the eye and confused it simultaneously. These are 3 of Brother Ambrose's 7 volumes on transformation, the culmination of his life's work synthesizing classical sources, Eastern mystical traditions, and his own experimental findings. Holmes accepted one of the volumes with obvious reverence, opening it carefully to examine the contents. Watson leaned closer, glimpsing text that seemed to shift and reconfigure as he attempted to focus on it, a phenomenon he attributed to fatigue and the uncertain light, though some deeper instinct suggested more unsettling explanations. The diagrams showed human figures in various stages of transformation, surrounded by Latin phrases and what appeared to be instructions for ritual practices involving lunar observation, fasting, herbal preparations, and mental disciplines designed to achieve states of consciousness unavailable to ordinary awareness. Brother Ambrose believed, Thornwood explained, his voice taking on the cadence of lecture, falling into patterns established through years of teaching, that human form was not fixed, but rather a kind of consensus, an agreement between consciousness and matter that could be renegotiated under specific conditions. He drew on sources ranging from Ovid's Metamorphoses to Tibetan texts on consciousness transfer, arguing that transformation was not supernatural, but rather an application of natural laws poorly understood by conventional science. The fire popped softly, sending sparks up the chimney, and outside the wind had risen, carrying with it the salt smell of the marshes and the distant sound of night birds calling their territorial claims. Watson found himself deeply conflicted, his medical training insisting that what Thornwood described was impossible, while his own eyes had witnessed its manifestation, creating cognitive dissonance that no amount of rationalization could entirely resolve. The ritual requires preparation, Thornwood continued, his gaze now distant, reviewing internal experiences. Weeks of specific diet and meditation, the cultivation of particular mental states, exposure to moonlight during specific lunar phases. The transformation itself is not imposed from without, but rather emerges from within, consciousness reshaping matter through mechanisms that Brother Ambrose compared to how intention moves limbs or how imagination generates dreams. It is agonizing and ecstatic simultaneously, a death and birth occurring in the same moment, the dissolution of one form and the emergence of another. Holmes had been listening with complete attention, occasionally making small notes in his pocketbook, and now he posed the question Watson most wanted answered: can the transformation be controlled? Are you able to maintain human consciousness within the altered form? And more critically, can you choose when to transform, or has the ritual bound you to involuntary change with each full moon? Thornwood's expression became profoundly sad, a weariness that transcended mere physical exhaustion and spoke to existential burden. That is the crux of my tragedy, Mr. Holmes. Brother Ambrose's texts describe the transformation as something to be mastered through practice, consciousness learning to maintain coherence across forms, the practitioner eventually gaining voluntary control over when and how to shift between states. But I was impatient, driven by desperation to prove theories that had cost me my career and reputation. I rushed the preparatory stages, attempted the full transformation before achieving the necessary mental discipline. He paused, closing his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, they glistened with unshed tears. Now I am trapped in a cycle I cannot escape. Each full moon compels the transformation regardless of my will, and while I retain some measure of human awareness in my altered state, it is fragmented, overwhelmed by sensory inputs and instincts foreign to human consciousness. I remember afterwards, remember everything, the way the world appears through lupine senses, the overwhelming power and freedom of that form, and beneath it all the terrible isolation of being neither fully human nor fully animal, but something caught between, belonging nowhere. Watson felt profound compassion stirring, seeing in Thornwood not a monster to be feared or destroyed, but a victim of his own ambition and curiosity, a scholar who had ventured too far into mysteries that demanded more caution than he had exercised. Is there no way to reverse the process? Surely if transformation is possible in one direction, it might be achieved in the other, returning you permanently to human form. Brother Ambrose's texts suggest that possibility, Thornwood acknowledged, but they are incomplete. The volumes I possess describe the initial transformation and the early stages of mastery, but the later volumes, those dealing with advanced control and potential reversal, remain lost. I have searched for them obsessively, following every possible lead, but thus far without success. I am condemned to continue transforming each month, retreating to these ruins where I can harm no one, waiting for some resolution I cannot envision. The conversation continued deep into the night, Thornwood sharing details of his research and his experiences, Holmes probing gently for information that might illuminate paths forward. They discussed the physical mechanisms of transformation, the role of consciousness in maintaining bodily integrity, the parallels between Thornwood's condition and cases of extreme dissociative states Watson had encountered in his medical practice. The tea grew cold and was replaced with fresh brewing. The fire was tended and fed, and through it all, the sense grew that they were engaged not merely in investigation, but in something approaching therapy, providing Thornwood perhaps the first opportunity in months to speak honestly about his condition with listeners who neither dismissed his account nor recoiled in horror from its implications. Dawn approached with its customary patience, gray light seeping gradually into the cottage through gaps in the covered windows, transforming the warm interior from a space of candlelight and shadow into something more ordinary, more anchored in the daylight world of tangible objects and natural law. Thornwood had grown quieter as the night progressed, his initial relief at unburdening himself giving way to a kind of peaceful exhaustion, as though the act of telling his story had redistributed its weight more evenly across his consciousness. He sat now with his hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold, his gaze fixed on the dying fire, and Watson recognized in his posture the aspect of a patient approaching the end of a long illness, that mixture of resignation and hope that characterizes those who have fought valiantly but understand the limits of what fighting can achieve. Holmes had filled several pages of his notebook with observations and sketches, capturing not only the factual content of Thornwood's account, but also those subtler elements of tone and implication that might prove significant upon later reflection. Now he set the notebook aside and leaned forward, his expression conveying that particular combination of intellectual engagement and genuine compassion that emerged when he encountered mysteries that touched human suffering directly rather than merely abstract puzzles requiring solution. Mr. Thornwood, Holmes said gently, I believe your situation, while extraordinary, is not necessarily hopeless. The texts you possess, incomplete though they are, represent knowledge accumulated through years of careful study and experimentation. If Brother Ambrose achieved mastery over transformation, as his writings suggest, then that mastery operates according to principles that can be understood and potentially replicated. What you require is not merely the lost volumes, though recovering those would certainly prove valuable, but rather a systematic investigation of what you have already learned through your own experiences, documented carefully and analyzed for patterns that might illuminate paths toward greater control. Thornwood looked up, hope flickering tentatively across his features like sunlight through moving clouds. You believe it possible that I might achieve mastery despite my imperfect beginning? That the transformation might become voluntary rather than compulsory? I believe the human mind possesses remarkable capacity for adaptation and learning, Holmes replied, and that consciousness, whatever its ultimate nature, demonstrates considerable plasticity when given appropriate framework and motivation. You have been approaching your condition as a curse to be endured in isolation, but perhaps it might be reconceptualized as a skill to be developed through practice, with assistance rather than in solitude. Watson found himself nodding agreement, his medical understanding suggesting parallels with rehabilitation following injury or illness, where the body and mind together must learn new patterns of function through patient, systematic effort. There are techniques, he offered, developed for helping patients regain control over bodily processes disrupted by trauma or disease. Breathing exercises, meditation practices, gradual exposure to triggering conditions under controlled circumstances. Perhaps similar methods might be adapted to your unique situation. The three men sat in contemplative silence as full morning established itself outside, the sounds of awakening day filtering through the cottage walls, birds singing their territorial claims, distant voices of workers beginning their daily routines, the ordinary world continuing its operations indifferent to the extraordinary discussions occurring in this isolated space. The fire had burned down to embers, glowing softly in their bed of ash, and Thornwood rose to tend it, adding fresh wood with movements that had become automatic through repetition, the small domestic ritual seeming to center him in preparation for whatever came next. "I confess," Thornwood said, his back still turned as he watched flames catch and spread through the new fuel, "that isolation has been perhaps my greatest burden these past months. The transformation itself, agonizing though it is, lasts only hours. But the loneliness, the sense of being fundamentally separated from humanity by knowledge and experience that cannot be shared, that extends through all my waking hours, regardless of what form I inhabit. To have you here, to speak freely without fear of disbelief or revulsion, this alone has provided more relief than I dared hope for." Holmes rose and moved to stand beside Thornwood at the hearth, and Watson saw in his friend's posture that quality of complete presence, the ability to focus entirely on the moment and the person before him without distraction or judgment. "You need not face this alone," Holmes said quietly. "Watson and I have encountered many phenomena that challenge conventional understanding, and we have learned that isolation compounds difficulty, while collaboration often reveals solutions invisible to solitary effort. If you are willing, we would propose a course of action, combining continued research with careful documentation of your experiences and systematic exploration of techniques for developing greater control." Thornwood turned to face Holmes directly, searching his face for some sign of insincerity or hidden agenda, and apparently finding none, for his expression softened into something approaching peace. "I accept your assistance gratefully, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. I have exhausted my own resources and insights, and find myself willing, even eager, to try approaches I had not previously considered. If there is hope of achieving mastery, of transforming this curse into something I might control, or even find purpose within, then I will pursue that hope with all the determination I once brought to my academic research." They spent the remainder of the morning establishing practical arrangements, Holmes proposing that Thornwood maintain a detailed journal documenting his experiences before, during, and after transformation, noting any variations in the process, any moments where he felt increased control or awareness, any factors that seemed to influence the transformation's character or duration. Watson offered to design a program of physical and mental exercises drawn from his medical knowledge, practices that might strengthen the connection between consciousness and bodily processes, building gradually toward greater voluntary control over the transformation itself. "The next full moon is 3 weeks distant," Holmes noted, consulting the astronomical tables he had brought. "This provides time for preparation, for practicing the techniques Watson will teach, for studying the manuscripts more thoroughly to identify passages that might offer guidance you previously overlooked. When the transformation comes, Watson and I will be present, observing and documenting, ready to assist if you experience difficulty or danger, providing the support that transforms ordeal into experiment." The practical planning seemed to energize Thornwood, giving him purpose beyond mere endurance, a sense that his condition might be studied systematically rather than simply suffered through in isolation. They discussed logistics and contingencies, what equipment might prove useful, what safety measures should be implemented, how to communicate findings to potential future researchers should Thornwood's experiences ultimately contribute to broader understanding of consciousness and physical form. By the time they departed the cottage, midday sun had broken through the morning's clouds, casting warm light across the monastery ruins and transforming them from the mysterious nighttime landscape they had explored into something more approachable. Ancient stones that spoke of human history and persistence rather than supernatural terror. Blackwood walked with them to the gatehouse, his weathered face showing relief at learning that the creature haunting his grounds was not some mindless beast, but a man trapped in extraordinary circumstances, seeking understanding rather than causing harm. The journey back to Baker Street passed in comfortable conversation, Holmes and Watson discussing the philosophical implications of what they had witnessed and learned, the questions Thornwood's condition raised about the nature of consciousness and identity, the relationship between mind and matter that conventional science assumed was fixed, but which Brother Ambrose's text suggested might be more fluid than previously imagined. The city unfolded around them, vast and ordinary, millions of lives proceeding in blessed ignorance of the mysteries unfolding in its margins, and Watson found himself grateful for both the extraordinary knowledge he had gained and the ordinary comforts to which they would soon return. Mrs. Hudson welcomed them home with her customary mix of relief and gentle reproach, insisting they eat proper meals and rest before undertaking whatever further investigations their minds were already planning. They complied, recognizing the wisdom in her mothering, and Watson found himself sleeping deeply for the first time in days, his dreams filled with images of transformation and moonlight, of ancient texts and modern consciousness, all blending together in the peculiar logic that governs sleep. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm, with regular visits to Thornwood's cottage, where Watson guided him through exercises designed to strengthen awareness of bodily processes, teaching breathing techniques and meditation practices drawn from various traditions, adapting them to the unique requirements of someone preparing to undergo radical physical transformation. Holmes, meanwhile, continued researching both the historical questions surrounding Brother Ambrose and the theoretical frameworks that might explain or predict the mechanisms of transformation, consulting with scientists and mystics alike, building a comprehensive understanding from fragments of knowledge scattered across disciplines. As the moon approached fullness once more, they prepared carefully, assembling equipment and establishing protocols, ready to observe and document while providing whatever support Thornwood might require. The night of transformation found them once again at the monastery ruins, but this time not as hidden observers, but as acknowledged witnesses and assistants, present by invitation rather than through stealth, committed to helping rather than merely studying. What transpired that night, and in subsequent months as Thornwood gradually developed greater mastery over his condition, must perhaps remain private, details known only to those directly involved. Suffice to say that transformation, when approached not as affliction, but as practice, when supported by friendship and guided by systematic method, proved more amenable to conscious influence than Thornwood had dared hope. Whether he ever achieved complete voluntary control, whether he ultimately recovered the lost volumes of Brother Ambrose's texts, whether he found peace with his dual nature, or discovered means to return permanently to singular human form, these questions extend beyond the scope of this particular account. What can be said with certainty is that mysteries persist at the margins of understanding, that the boundaries we imagine between possible and impossible often reflect limitations of imagination rather than absolute truth, and that extraordinary circumstances reveal most clearly the value of compassion, friendship, and the refusal to abandon those who find themselves isolated by knowledge or experience too strange for easy sharing. And now, dear listener, as our tale draws to its close and the first light of your own morning perhaps begins to touch your windows, I thank you for accompanying us on this journey through moonlight and transformation, through ancient ruins and modern mysteries. If this story has brought you comfort, if it has eased your passage towards sleep or provided companionship through quiet hours, then perhaps you might consider subscribing to join me again for future tales, pressing that small button that connects us across the distance, leaving a like if your heart moves you to such gesture. But more than these small courtesies, I wish you peaceful rest, dreams that carry you gently through the night, and awakening refreshed into whatever morning awaits you. May you find in your own life the courage to face mysteries with curiosity rather than fear, the compassion to support those who walk difficult paths, and the wisdom to recognize that we are all, in our various ways, creatures of transformation, constantly becoming something new while retaining connection to all we have been. Sleep well wherever you are, whatever hour you inhabit as you hear these words. The world continues its turning. Mysteries abound in shadow and light alike. But for now, let understanding rest. Let questions dissolve into dreams, and let peace claim you as the moon claims the night sky, constant and gentle and always returning. Good night.